In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, bringing an end to the world's largest communist empire. Its red flag came down over the Kremlin, and the Cold War was over. Many believed communism as an ideology had failed for good. And yet, across the world, China remained, and not only survived, but thrived. Today, China is the world's second-largest economy and an emerging superpower. While the USSR disintegrated into 15 republics, the Chinese Communist Party remains firmly in control of a unified nation of more than 1 billion people. So, why did communism collapse in the Soviet Union but endure in China? To answer this, we need to look at differences in economics, politics, leadership, and culture. The shared origins of communism in China and the USSR. Both China and the Soviet Union were born out of revolution. The Soviet Union emerged in 1917 from the chaos of World War I and the Russian Revolution, led by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. China, decades later, saw the Communist Party rise after years of warlords, Japanese invasion, and civil war. In 1949, Mao Zedong declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. Both countries built their legitimacy on promises of equality, anti-imperialism, and modernization. Both pursued central planning, collectivization, and rapid industrialization. But from the very beginning, the paths diverged. Economic strategies: rigidity versus adaptability. The Soviet Union's economy was highly centralized. The state dictated every quota, every price, every factory's output. This system was good at mobilizing resources for heavy industry and the military, but terrible at providing consumer goods or fostering innovation. By the 1970s, the USSR was stagnating. Shortages were constant, technology lagged, and people waited in long lines for bread and shoes. China, under Mao Zedong, initially followed a similar path. Collectivization led to disaster during the Great Leap Forward, which caused famine and millions of deaths. The Cultural Revolution further destabilized society. But here's the difference. After Mao's death in 1976, China pivoted. Deng Xiaoping launched reforms in 1978 known as Reform and Opening Up. China introduced market incentives in agriculture. Peasants could sell surplus crops. Special economic zones welcomed foreign investment. State-owned enterprises were allowed some autonomy, and private business slowly re-emerged. The Communist Party of China maintained political control, but adapted economically. The Soviet Union, by contrast, resisted deep reforms until it was too late. When Gorbachev finally tried with perestroika, the changes destabilized the system rather than saving it. In short, the USSR clung to rigidity, while China embraced flexibility. Political strategy: controlled reform versus sudden liberalization. Politics was another key difference. In the USSR, Gorbachev introduced glasnost, political openness. He reduced censorship, allowed criticism of the party, and permitted more democratic participation. This might sound positive, but it was destabilizing. Once people had the freedom to speak, decades of anger, nationalism, and resentment poured out. The authority of the Communist Party collapsed quickly. China, on the other hand, never made this mistake. Deng Xiaoping allowed economic reforms, but was ruthless in maintaining political control. When protests broke out in Tiananmen Square in 1989, demanding democracy, the government crushed them with force. It was a brutal decision, but it reinforced the party's rule. The lesson was clear. China would open its markets, but never its politics. The USSR tried both at once and paid the price: nationalism and cultural legitimacy. Another factor is national identity. The Soviet Union was a multi-ethnic empire of 15 republics and over 100 national groups. Russians made up the majority, but Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Lithuanians, and others often felt like second-class citizens. Nationalist movements simmered beneath the surface, waiting for a chance to break free. When Moscow weakened, these republics chose independence. China, too, is multi-ethnic. but the sense of being Chinese is far stronger. For over 2,000 years, Chinese dynasties fell and rose, but the idea of China as one civilization endured. Even when different ethnic groups like the Mongols or Manchus ruled, they declared themselves legitimate rulers of China. This deep-rooted civilizational identity gave the Chinese Communist Party a stronger foundation of legitimacy. The party portrayed itself not just as a political regime, but as the guardian of Chinese unity and revival after the century of humiliation. The USSR was seen as an artificial empire. China was seen as a continuation of an ancient civilization. Leadership and timing leadership also mattered enormously. The Soviet Union in the 1980s had a series of aging, uninspired leaders. Brezhnev presided over stagnation. Andropov and Chernenko ruled briefly, both in poor health. When Gorbachev came to power, he had bold ideas but lacked a clear strategy for balancing reform with stability. His good intentions led to chaos. China's leadership transition was more fortunate. Deng Xiaoping, though never officially president, steered the country with pragmatism. His famous phrase was, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." In other words, ideology was secondary to results. Deng carefully sequenced reforms, first agriculture, then light industry, then opening to foreign capital, while preserving party control. Timing also mattered. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was already locked in an exhausting arms race with the United States and bankrupting itself in Afghanistan. China, meanwhile, avoided costly global conflicts and focused inward on growth. Global context. The international environment was another factor. The Soviet Union was engaged in a zero-sum Cold War with the United States. Its legitimacy was tied to being the leader of global communism and a superpower. Once it started losing influence in Eastern Europe, its empire unraveled. China, however, played a different game. By the late 1970s, it improved relations with the US and even gained American support as a counterbalance to the Soviets. Instead of competing militarily with Washington, China integrated into the global economy, joining the World Trade Organization later and becoming the factory of the world. This gave China access to capital, technology, and markets that fueled its rise, advantages the Soviet Union never enjoyed. Ideology versus pragmatism. At its core, the Soviet Union clung to Marxist-Leninist ideology even when it was failing. The party's legitimacy rested on the claim that communism would eventually outperform capitalism. When living standards stagnated, belief in the system collapsed. China, by contrast, redefined communism. Under Deng, the party shifted its message. Socialism with Chinese characteristics. Market reforms were not betrayal. They were adaptation. The party told the people, yes, you can get rich, but do it under the leadership of the Communist Party. This ideological flexibility kept communism relevant in China, even as it morphed into something very different from Marx's original vision. Why communism survived in China but not in the USSR. To summarize, communism survived in China but collapsed in the Soviet Union because 1. Economic strategy. China embraced market reforms early, while the USSR resisted until too late. 2. Political control. China repressed political dissent, while the USSR liberalized and lost authority. 3. National identity. China's civilizational unity was stronger than the USSR's fragile multinational structure. 4. Leadership. Deng Xiaoping's pragmatism versus Gorbachev's destabilizing reforms. 5. Global context. China leveraged globalization, while the USSR bankrupted itself in rivalry. 6. Ideological flexibility. China redefined socialism to fit reality. The USSR clung to dogma. Lessons for the future. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the survival of Chinese communism reveal a powerful lesson. Systems that adapt survive. Systems that resist change collapse. China's Communist Party transformed itself from rigid ideology into a pragmatic guardian of national revival. The Soviet Union could not. Today, as China rises and Russia struggles, the legacy of these different paths is clear. Communism as a global ideology may have faded, but in China it continues, reshaped into something uniquely Chinese. The Soviet red flag came down in 1991. In Beijing, it still flies. If you found this exploration insightful, give this video a like, share it with a friend, and subscribe to Timeless Questions for more deep dives into philosophy, history, and human nature. Because the questions may be ancient, but the wisdom is timeless.